The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Our guest today is Kevin Crossley-Holland, British author and poet, visiting Fulbright lecturer at the College of St. Olaf in Northfield. He's also the recipient of the Carnegie Medal, England's highest honor for a children's book. He'll be talking with Susan Richardson, Children's Services Librarian at the Red Wing Public Library, and currently the chairperson of the Minnesota Library Association's Children and Young People section. They'll be discussing British folklore and Anglo-Saxon literature.
Kevin Crossley-Holland, we're delighted to have you here today. What brought you first to the Midwest?
The first time I came here was in 1980. When I was 39, and I was invited here by a marvelous poet, I think one of the best poets in Minnesota, but he's an Australian, called Keith Harrison. And I came on a writing tour and a lecturing tour with him. And I stopped and gave various lectures at places like Carleton and St. Olaf. And that's slowly grown over the last years, an affection between St. Olaf especially and me, and I've gone back now to teach there for a couple of times.
And you are here for your second semester of teaching there. Is the Scandinavian heritage here in Minnesota of particular interest to you, given your interest in Norse mythology and folklore?
Yes, I feel myself very much to be a child of Northwest Europe. The way in which people always look away to the clement lapping of the Mediterranean and ignore the fact that their own origins are in the bracing flows of the Baltic, and moreover that there are such fabulous story hordes in the north, the Icelandic sagas and the Germanic heroic legends and the Norse myths and the Old English poems too, all composed in that wonderful gritty cacophonous language. Higa shotha hiadra, heota the chenra, mord shotha mara, the oramagan litlath. Quite often we forget that our own inheritance as a language, English, comes from two sources, not just from Latin, but from Old English too. And to come to Minnesota and find here it's packed out, bristling with Scandinavians, all eager to find about their own origins, has meant that teaching Old English and teaching Scandinavian mythology and so on has been a very great pleasure.
And your book, The Norse Myths, is a marvelous collection of those. Did that come about before you came to Minnesota?
It did. I published it in 1981, The Norse Myths. And I wrote it as people, I think, quite often write books, because they cast around and find that the book that they're looking for doesn't exist. And I looked and found one or two quite good versions of the Norse mythology for children, Roger Lance, Len Green, and so on, but there wasn't really a full-blooded version of this fabulous, racy, ice-bright collection of tales of the gang of gods, Odin and Thor and Freyr and Loki and the giants, the monsters, the dwarves. It's a great nine-world self-referring, nine-world within a world. Tolkien, of course, many people have read The Fellowship of the Ring and The Hobbit and so on. I heard him lecture at Oxford. Just as I went to Oxford, he'd retired. And he used to march up and down a platform with his black cloak flying behind him like a flag, reciting Old English. And his work derives heavily from Norse mythology and from Old English poetry. And when I found these great stories, which are profound stories, which try and explain to us how we are as we are, why we are as we are, why the world is as it is. Everyone knows that Thor is responsible for the sound of thunder when he races across the floor of heaven. His chariot wheels, drawn by goats, his chariot make a roaring sound. But the whole of the cosmos is explained in a mythology. It is an account of the meaning of the world. It's an alternative religion. And so I thought I'd jump in the deep end and have a shot at retelling it myself.
And we're glad you did. Do you find that your students at St. Olaf come to you with a good knowledge of mythology, particularly of their Scandinavian background, or?
It's a very interesting question, and I think that on the whole, insofar as students, insofar as high school kids are versed in mythology, it's the classical mythology. We all are brought up on the great cornerstones of Western society, which are the Bible, and classical mythology, or at least we traditionally have been, although that, at least in Western Europe, is beginning to slightly die out. People are not attending to these sources. On the whole, people don't know anything like so much about the Norse myths, and yet there are these 32 brilliant tales which have a beginning and a middle and an end. And so I set myself to learn a bit of Old Norse and to spend some time in Iceland and get to grips with it.
Now, you are also a specialist in British folk tales and mythology. Your British folk tales, new versions, came out a couple of years ago to rave reviews. In those folk tales, as in the folk tales of any country, there is a lot of violence. And a topic today that parents and educators talk about a lot is the violence in these tales that we think of as children's tales. Parents fondly remember hearing Hansel and Gretel and want their child to go to see the puppet show of Hansel and Gretel at the library, and then get there, and as they see the story unfold, remember how violent it is and are very upset that this violence is is something they're exposing their children to. Can you comment on violence in folk tales and children and their exposure?
I think, first of all, it's true that there is a lot of violence in folk tales. But it is not violence which is a kind of premeditated wallow in violence for its own sake. It's very much and then he knocked his block off and on to the next episode. That's the first point. But the second point is this, that all around, kids are witnessing terrible violence. They have only to switch on one of the infinite number of TV channels to see unedited, uncensored, uncontexted violence presented to them. Rapes, muggings, murders, casual violence of all kinds. That is never the case within folk tales. The violence is always part of a wider moral context. Those who do violent things get their comeuppance, are put into shape by the society within which they move, put into prison, or get put to death themselves, or whatever. That's to say, the message is violence reaps its own punishment. So that I think that whoever said the world wasn't violent, the world is violent, but that folk tales present violence within a moral context.
When you retold some stories, some you put in a traditional setting and some you put into a contemporary setting. Can you comment on is it just how a story strikes you? Or
well, I think, Susan, that writers need to adopt strategies with folk tales. After all, they were written down 100 years ago, 200 years ago, some of them 800 years ago, and they'd been told for generations before that. How is one to make them new for readers, especially children, in the last decade of the 20th century? Presumably by adopting strategies and not just telling them in the voice of the original author. So what can you do? There are all kinds of things you can do. You can step inside the story and tell it from the inside out, or you can give it a modern context, as you say. And so one tale that I wrote, I actually gave an urban backstreet mugging as a context for a start. I was also conscious of the fact that most folk tales were told in villages to populations that were largely rural. When Wilhelm and Jakob Grimm in Germany, in Saxony, when Arnason in Iceland and Grundtvig in Denmark and Arnason and Asbjørnsen and Moe in Norway were collecting their tales, they were all collecting from rural societies. But we now I don't know what the situation is in the United States, but in England, 90% of the population live in towns. The same is going to be substantially true in the United States. So one strategy is clearly to give a tale an urban context, to engage children at a level they can immediately relate to.
It's been said that newscasting has replaced storytelling in America. We're more hungry for the facts than we are for tales. Do you think that's true? Is it true in England? Do you see a difference between America and England?
There's a wonderful folk tale called Magic Ointment, in which a woman who pries once too often, or no, puts some magic ointment on one eye, can see two worlds. With one eye she can see the world of toothpaste tubes and pyjamas and what shall I wear today and heavens, have I bought enough for lunch or am I late for school? But with the other world she can see the world of enchantment, the world of the just beyond the immediate and actual. It seems to me that we need both eyes. You can't do without the toothpaste and the am I late for school, but you can't possibly do without the imagination. Otherwise this interview series wouldn't exist. I mean, it is to celebrate the world of the imagination, which as I understand it is a redeeming world. So sure, we need Ted Koppel and Dan Rather and the English equivalents, but equally sure we need those stories which feed the imagination. I don't see that the two are in opposition to one another. Rather, they are both necessary and run alongside one another. When we watch television, even when we listen to the radio, which is a far more highly developed art form, I think, in England, if I may say so, with the BBC than here, you get fed a huge number of stories, but you may not adjust the pace at which you hear them. That's not true when you read folktale. You can step into it and you have an instant line of communication, private line of communication, between you and the author. And you have the privilege as reader to modulate the speed at which you absorb that story. That's to say, it's a reciprocal experience. It isn't something that's blasted at you. You've so often seen, and so have I, people sitting in front of the television in a sort of comatose state. It doesn't ask you to respond. Story does.
And maybe just the media there, a radio too, as you're listening without the visual aids in front of you, the radio forces you to make your own pictures in your mind, so be a strength for the storytelling format.
I think that's true. Yes. In England there are quite a number of programs in which there is storytelling. And some of it is improvised, some of it is read. On the other hand, you have here in Minnesota, and I gather throughout the United States, a marvelous number of storytelling societies and conventions and so on, as a resuscitated tradition here.
There is a revival.
It's very, very lively indeed, much more so than it is in the British Isles.
Interesting. I have watched you work with many children, and I've watched you, as you are trying to inspire them to write, use the form of a riddle for them to form the basis of a story. Why do you choose that format of the riddle, and what makes it work so well? Because it does work.
In the Republic, Plato says that riddles are like extended metaphors, and they delight people because they tease them. And the minute you get the answer to it, you think, that's it, I knew the answer, says Plato. I think that's right. So that the good riddles, like the one the Sphinx asked and pushed off the ledge any unfortunate who couldn't answer it, and indeed no one could answer it until Mr. Oedipus came along, was, what is it that has one voice in the morning and four legs in the one voice and four legs in the morning and two legs at lunchtime and three in the afternoon. Up go a forest of hands like ash grey spears, and everyone says it's a man who goes on all fours, or a woman who goes on all fours as a baby, and so on. Everyone knows this riddle. There is an enormous satisfaction in presenting the familiar in unfamiliar ways, and I think children are terribly good and flexible at making it new. Gerard Manley Hopkins said, there is a dearest freshness deep down things. That is so profoundly true. I once held up a green apple in front of a group of 8-year-old girls. And I said, don't tell me it's green and large and round. I can see that. Let's find out new things about this apple. And the first girl said to me, it'll cry if you bite it. And the next said, it's like a sphere. And the third girl said, it's speckled. And the fourth, picking up on the word play, because children are so good with onomatopoeia and so on, said it's freckled. And the fifth girl said it's got dark secrets inside it. And suddenly there was this other, no less true apple in the palm of my hand. Sure, it was large and green and round, but it had all these magic properties. That's how a riddle works. It tells you new things about everyday objects. So if I said, what is this object that's speckled and freckled and weeps when you bite it and has dark secrets, we might guess it was an apple.
The children who have worked with you are very lucky. I've seen some marvelous creative writing come from them. You use the riddle as the beginning. The one group had to come up with a riddle and the other group had to write a story around it. I'm trying to remember. The fisherman was the riddle that won from the group in Red Wing.
This was a group in the library at Red Wing in 1988, which is when I was here last year. And I invited them to write a riddle. Divided the children into pairs. One child, correct me if I'm wrong, this is what I remember, one wrote a riddle, and the other had to write a story including the riddle, but also including a fish.
Well, it was the river.
Including a river and a stranger. And one pair came up with this wonderful idea that a fisherman caught a fish, and the fish said, will you throw me back if I ask you a riddle and you can't answer it? And the fisherman said, that seems a fair deal. And the fish said, the fish described in its riddle the fisherman, and the fisherman couldn't recognize himself. And so the fish laughed and jumped back into the water. And there's a profound meaning in that story, it seemed to me, which is if you don't know yourself and you don't recognize yourself, how can you be entitled to hang on to anything else?
Yes. It's interesting that a few weeks after that happened, another little girl who had been in that group called up, and I had sent a copy of the winning story to all the participants so they could read what you had chosen as the best. And she said, I'm sure that I have read that story in a book in your library.
It had that kind of inevitability.
And I said, that's what folktales are all about, common elements that we find in every culture. The fisherman certainly is a character that we find in folktales.
Yes, I think a very good way of working with children is to identify and isolate the motifs in a folktale, like a night ride or a meeting with a ghost or something like that, and then invite children to dress it up in their own clothing. The motifs, as you justly say, are the bones. And they're the same from story to story.
But I did have a hard time convincing her that nothing had been plagiarized there. It was interesting that she was sure she had read that before.
Well, in that sense, people once said to me, is your work original? And I remember what Ralph Vaughan Williams, the great English composer, said about folk song as a definition. He said that it was like a number of blossoms with a common stem. That's a perfect description, really, of folktale, that they grow of the one stem, but each blossom is separate.
Yes. I want to mention your book, Storm, which won the 1985 Carnegie Medal, which we have right here today. The Carnegie Medal is awarded in Great Britain, as is the Newbery in America, for excellence in children's writing. Storm is the story of, well, it's a ghost story. What was its inspiration?
I was invited by a publisher in England, William Heinemann, to write a little ghost story, and to write it as almost the first book that children might read for themselves, age 7 or 8. And I did exactly what I've just been describing to you, actually. I found a tale, very obscure, I'm sure never printed except in scholarly journals, very short, just half a page long. It's a Scottish story of a ghost ride. And I thought, why not strip it right down to the 2 or 3 bones it has, and then make a completely new story out of it. And that's what I did. I think it was astoundingly lucky, like all prize books must be, to win the prize. In England there'd been a political lobby that said that the prize really ought to go soon to a book for younger children. And I don't know how it is with the Newbery Medal, but in England it had gone for 49 years in a row for books for 11, 12, 13-year-olds.
Yes.
And sure, it may be a good book, but it was certainly in the right place at the right time, because it had never before been awarded to a little sixpenny-sized book for younger children.
Well, it is a marvelous story, and it definitely is a good story for the middle grade readers and very accessible to them.
I may say that the American edition came out last week, and the American publishers, to my total fury, have made 106 changes.
In a book of this size.
Of a book of only 42 pages, most of them with pictures in,
Yes.
without so much as a by your leave. And while many of them are changes that you or I would easily have agreed on, like the word vacation for holiday, or cane for stick, or that sort of thing, there are also any number of whittling downs of the poetic language of the original. There's a little description here of how the old man in the story had become quite mild and milky, it says in the English version, like grain softened by mist. And the American publisher has put, he'd become quite weak and absent-minded. So at the minute I'm in a small rage about this.
So it was scheduled to come out now this week, November 13th, 1989.
Yes.
Is that on hold then?
Yes, barons have been required to stop shipping.
I see.
And becoming an American in my manner, I've sounded distinctly threatening as to what will happen if they don't stop it.
So it'll be a little while before we have this
Yes.
readily available to us and in our libraries. What are some new projects that you're working on?
A freelance writer's life is very odd, really. It's like walking along a tightrope and falling off now and then and dusting yourself down. No, it's more like being a sort of amateur juggler and chucking balls up in the air. My staple diet at any one time is a bit of radio work, a bit of television work, quite a lot of school visiting, college lecturing, a bit of publisher advising, and now this teaching at St. Olaf on a sort of semi-regular basis. We've got plans to come back again for another stint.
Good.
But my new writing projects, and the problem here is to get momentum going, are first of all an opera for children based on The Green Children, which is a story that I wrote 20 years ago. It was my second published children's book, my third published children's book. It's a 12th century folktale. And I've been commissioned with the composer Nicola Lefanu, who's a name to conjure with in England, to make an opera for children. And we have a small professional cast and orchestra, plus 120 children. And that's having it premiere next year, and then being taken on by the English National Opera. And there's a strong likelihood, I'm delighted to say, of a production in the Magnets, one of the Magnet schools in the cities here, in the fall of next year.
Great.
So that's one thing. And I see that story, which is about how two children with green tongues and tummy buttons and toes and skins turned up in a Suffolk village in the 12th century. I see it as a story about what is home, the way in which young children think of home as my bed, my room, my house, my mummy, my daddy. But home takes on different qualities as we grow older. It has to do with our families, our spouses, our careers. Our sense of place widens from house or from bed. And it has to do also, I think, the story with acceptance. How do people accept and tolerate one another? The way in which the intolerant members of one village in Suffolk in the 12th century leap on this green girl. They don't like the fact she's green, they don't like the fact she doesn't eat meat, they don't like the fact she's not English, etc., doesn't speak English. So it's about pressures to conform and home. Secondly, I'm writing a big book, big in quantity, don't know about quality, about King Arthur. A big adult novel, something I'd sworn never to do, either to write about Arthur, because there's such a torrent of bad books about Arthur all around, or to write an adult novel. I just didn't feel any need to do that. And suddenly I found myself launched into a vast Arthurian novel. So those are the two projects that I'm caught up in.
I want to ask a question about the opera now. As you described it to me earlier, the children, there's a portion of this opera that the children create themselves in a way?
It's a 90-minute opera. 5 schools are involved, and apart from performing the whole opera, each of the 5 schools has to actually write and compose a little 4 or 5 minute nugget within the fabric of the opera as a whole. That's to say, when the green boy grows ill, all the village try and cure him. They think of homeopathic remedies and exorcisms and spells and what have you. And I thought one school could be responsible for the writing and composing of that. And so I shall work in April of next year, April 1990, in one school. And then as soon as I've gone, the composer and instrumentalist will move in. And
and then how does, so each performance then is different. I mean, it's the performance of this opera in England will be different than it will be in the magnet schools in
absolutely
St.
true.
Paul.
There's that variable element within it, yes.
I know of one more recent project that I'd like you to comment on that's out and about now, The Stones Remain. And I think you worked on that, you told me, in a log cabin near Northfield.
The Stones Remain is a book about the stone circles and burial chambers which litter the British landscape. Everyone knows Stonehenge, I guess, but there are hundreds of stone circles like that. Who put them up 5,000 years ago? What for? How were they put up? What are the stories associated with them? And why do we keep going back to them? They're magnets too, to which people are drawn. And so I wrote a book about this, sitting in a little log house, you're quite right, outside Northfield, near Dundas, near the end of the world.
Yes. Now, you are a poet and a folklorist, a novelist, you've been a translator, you have been a lecturer and teacher. I know that you've worked with the BBC and done producing for them. So you have, we were talking about this earlier, kind of an old-fashioned man of letters. What do all of these things add up to?
A fascination with continuity, with belonging, with the presence of the past, with the feeling that we're only lessees or tenants on earth. We have responsibilities to those before us, our parents and grandparents, and we have responsibility to those to come.
Do we have time, I think, for a quick ghost story? Your very shortest story?
You know how much time we don't have, I don't know. Well, I'll tell you a very, very short one.
Okay.
There were 2 farmers working in a field. They'd been talking about ghosts earlier during the day, and they got to their lunch break, and one sat down and he said to the other as he picked up his glass of apple cider or whatever, he said, "Yeah, I don't believe in these here ghostesses." "Don't he?" said the other man. And he vanished.
Thank you for being with us today, Kevin Crossley-Holland.
Thank you, Kevin and Susan. We'll look forward to having you back on All About Kids. And thank you all for joining us today on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.